Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I'm really excited about chatting with our first guest. It's gone viral. The article has gone absolutely viral. It really has. I mentioned this on the television show on Friday. Terrific journalism. It's becoming a dirty word, really, isn't it, journalism these days? Our first guest is an award-winning journalist and author. He's been a foreign correspondent for many, many years. He spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times, and most of it as a foreign correspondent. Interestingly enough as well, he was the Times bureau chief in Nicaragua during the 1980s and in Germany during the early 1990s. So he's had an absolutely interesting career, to say the least. I'll tell you all about him in terms of where to buy his books. We'll talk about one or two of his books shortly as well. Let's welcome to the programme Stephen Kinzer. Stephen, thanks for taking the call. How are you?
Good. Great to be with you.
Well, thanks for doing it. I know you're in demand. First of all, the article in the Globe we saw it on Friday. It might have been written and published on Thursday. Was absolutely outstanding. To the point that it made me wonder how it ever got published. And I really mean that. I'm not being disingenuous. It's an absolute dissemination of what the media, the mass media has become today. And what's really incredible and timely about your article is what Amnesty International and Sky News in London reported on Saturday about the Russian army allegedly attacking civilians, killing civilians, and then coming back to kill those who come to aid those civilians. Because you wrote brilliantly on Thursday or Friday about the fact that militants leaving these cities that are being liberated by the Russian and Syrian army are doing great mischief as they leave, using rockets and gas on residents there. Stephen, brilliant article. Why is it that you're such a lone voice here? Why is it that this is the only article of its type we're reading over this weekend?
You might say, how did we even get to read one? That would be the other way to look at it. First of all, I think it's important to point out that this is not a situation, the one in Syria, in which there are a lot of good guys. There's no good and evil, although that's the way the outside world sometimes likes to see it. So I'm not trying to defend one side against the other, and I don't believe there's any side fighting in this war that is innocent of horrific crimes. So let's get past that. We're in a fantasy world that there's some kind of moderate force out there that just wants to reestablish a peaceful multi-confessional democracy in Syria. And let's face it, everybody has their own interests here and nobody has clean hands. What I pointed out in my article, however, is that certainly in the United States, and I think this is probably true in Europe as well, a false narrative has grown up that does portray a kind of a good versus evil view of what's happening in Syria. So we are told that there's some kind of virtuous coalition out here of America, Europe, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Kurds, and the moderate opposition, and Turkey. And then there's the other side of evil, and that would be, of course, Assad's government plus Russia and Iran. We are told that essentially everything Iran does is destabilizing, simply because it's Iran that's doing it. But in fact, Iran and the Assad government are the only forces, along with their Russian allies, that agree with the United States' view that the number one enemy in Syria is ISIS. Our so-called allies don't believe that. Israel doesn't believe it. Saudi Arabia doesn't believe it. The Turks don't believe it. So we're in this odd situation where we are allied with people who do not share our strategic goal. And the ones who share our strategic goal, which is principally the Assad government and mainly Iran, are demonized by us despite the fact that our interests are the same. So we've allowed emotion to take over the making of our foreign policy, and emotion is always the enemy of wise statesmanship.
Stephen, are our interests the same, though? Because it's apparent that the Russians have had a lot of very quick success in driving these lunatics, let's call them what they are, these jihadists, out of certain areas. We were at it for a couple of years. By we, I mean, of course, the United States and its allies, and latterly latterly Britain, of course, after the parliamentary vote late last year. How is it that there was such little success in terms of the success of the United States and her allies compared to what Russia has achieved? That's got to be suspicious.
The key thing that Russia provided in this fight was air power. Now, air power alone is not enough to turn the tide of battle. If it had been, the tide of battle would have been turned by American air power. You need to have forces on the ground to come in after the bombing. So here you have a combination where the Russians are providing the air power, and the Syrian army, in some cases also the Kurds and Shia militias, are coming in afterwards to do the ground fighting. So finally, the Assad government has this combination of air power and ground forces that are allowing it to push back ISIS and these other jihadist groups.
I mentioned a few times on this programme, this is an independent programme, and we seek out opinions that you don't always hear or that you don't often hear on the mass media. One of the things that really intrigued me, Stephen, were comments made on French television last year by Roland Dumas, whom you've covered, of course, in your time as a journalist, former French foreign minister under Mitterrand. A couple of times, actually, he held that position. He said last year on French television, maybe even the year before last, is that when he was travelling in London in 2009, that basically agents of the British government, namely the intelligence agencies in London, were telling him that plans were already underway to do something in Syria, to have a go at the Assad regime. Isn't that where we are, really? Is that what we now have? Are people like Barack Obama and John Kerry, and over here, David Cameron and others, saying, screaming bloody murder, trying to hang on to this whole idea of moderate rebels, when in fact that's where this all began, was in the mid to late 2000s, a deliberate attempt to undermine the government of Bashar al-Assad, regardless what anybody might think of him and that government. This has been typical. I mean, you've written so eloquently about this over the years in your books about Central America. We've gone in there and completely destabilised the country by doing what we've done, by arming people that are lunatics, claiming that they're legitimate opposition to the Assad government, when they're not. That's what's happened, isn't it?
Absolutely. We have lost sight of the fact that governments in these countries provide a measure of stability. So are they governments that encourage opposition and allow people to speak out about politics? No. But, I was even in Saddam's Iraq. I covered Saddam's Iraq. And that was a way harsher dictatorship than anything we have in Syria. However, even in Saddam's Iraq, as long as you bit your tongue and didn't speak about politics, if you made that choice, you could live a normal life. You could send your kids to school. You could sit in a cafe at 9 o'clock at night and sip tea. Life would be normal. Now, if someone in Syria decides, I want to live a normal life, what can I do? There's nothing you can do. You cannot escape from this upheaval and violence. So I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that stability and personal safety and security is the number one thing that people want. I had somebody tell me when I was in Iran a few months ago, something that could easily be said in Syria and many other Middle Eastern countries. This guy said to me, you Westerners are so different from us. You expect your government to be good, and when it's not good, you get angry. But we've never had good governments here for thousands of years. We're used to it. We live with it. But here in the West, we think, this is a government that represses people. It's brutal, so we must destroy it. Don't think about what comes next. Just think about destroying what's there now. And we have this fantasy that there's a little Switzerland waiting to emerge immediately as soon as we decapitate a dictatorship. And it's that feeling, it's that impulse that brought us to Libya, that brought us to Iraq, and that has now brought us to chaos in Syria.
Stephen Kinzer is our guest this hour. We've got Stephen for another 15, 20 minutes. It's great to have him on. Go to stephenkinzer.com. His books are terrific. Stephen, I read your book, All the Shah's Men. I was studying at Salford University in Manchester in 2004, and I read All the Shah's Men, an American coup, and basically the roots of Middle East terror. That book about what happened to Mossadegh and the lead up to that in 53. It's an outstanding book. It really is. And it had a profound effect on me because I'm a history graduate who regurgitated, mainstream history, the sort of history that you learn high school history and stuff. Stephen has written about this, of course, Overthrow America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, published by Times Books. These are terrific books. His article, I've tweeted his article from the Globe on Friday last. It's an outstanding article, a scathing, withering assessment of how the mainstream media behaves, not just in the United States but elsewhere. Stephen, are the media now, and I mean in general, there are people like you and Fisk and others telling the truth and asking questions. Are the media now, globally, a clear and present danger to the health and to the well-being of ordinary people like me? Is that how bad the media has become?
Certainly in the last 10 or 15 years with the emergence of the internet, one of the big effects that this has had on journalism is that the core of foreign correspondence has been decimated. So you don't have large numbers of people going to the countries where these events actually are happening. How then do they write about them? Well, they sit in London or they sit in Washington and they call a few ministers, and they call a few bureaucrats, they call a few embassies, they check in with the so-called experts at the think tanks, and then they think they've covered all sides. So what they've essentially become is a kind of a sounding board for the power elite. Whatever is the mainstream view of government becomes the view of the press. Now, I understand that political leaders may want to skew reality to fit their own goals, but that's not what the press should be doing. Instead of sitting around in this giant circle just talking to each other in this echo chamber, we're the ones that should be out there looking at things in a different way. And we don't do that anymore. I think the temptation has become too great to just join into the establishment. When you're in these big cities, in world capitals like London and Washington, your access to power and the respect that you have among your peers is based on your willingness to parrot the official line. If you are more than 5 degrees off the mainstream, you're considered some kind of a wacko who has no reason to have a voice at the foreign policy table. It never ceases to impress me how powerful is the force that pulls journalists into this consensus and grinds them up until they become just purveyors of the same kind of pablum that you get from government leaders. And I do think we are participating, we the press are participating in the dumbing down of the readers. And it's a dangerous thing. You know, our ignorance is worse than the ignorance of other people. You know, it's too bad if people in Bolivia or Bangladesh don't know what's happening in Syria, but it doesn't really affect the world. Our ignorance affects the world because we bomb countries based on our ignorance, and the press feeds this ignorance. So I feel that the closing of space for alternative opinions about complex issues like Syria does contribute to upheaval and turmoil in the world.
I remember, Stephen, starting out on commercial radio in Ireland. I'm obviously Irish. You've probably guessed, in Waterford City in Ireland back in the mid to late 1990s. And what became apparent to me very early on, and I was too young to ask any questions, I think. That's my excuse anyway. I never complained about it. But in the newsroom, we were literally rip and read. We would take anything that came from AFP or came from independent radio news in Dublin. We would rip it down. It would come off the fax machine. We would rearrange that story into language suitable for radio, and we would broadcast it, Stephen. And I used to think to myself, that can't be right, surely. How do we know that there's any veracity to that story? How can we stand over that? And yet that's what we did. And in the coming years, I would go to events in Dublin where all the commercial radio stations would meet for a big party, for an awards night or something. And I would meet some of the other presenters and journalists and editors, and they would say, yeah, that's what we do, really. We just take it down and we rewrite it. And I began to think, that is devastating, that isn't journalism. Parroting is probably too kind a word for that. And you've just described that as pretty much the way most bureaus, most offices, whether it's the Washington Post or the New York Times, that's pretty much what happens there.
We look for the symptoms of upheaval and turmoil, and we report on those. We always get pictures of starving refugees and bombed out buildings, and this stirs our compassion and our outrage. But we don't ever seem to ask why this is happening. What's the reason? Why is the war going on? All we see is the result, and then we're left to kind of puzzle who's responsible. And who is responsible? It's always the people that have always been our enemies, the ones that we've been trying to get from the first day. In the United States in particular, and I think in Europe to a certain degree, for example, Iran is always a demon. Russia is a demon. We still have this holdover from the Cold War. It's difficult for us to get past some of our old prejudices. You know, I used to love that movie called Arsenic and Old Lace with Cary Grant.
Yeah.
There's a great line in there that always sticks in my head. So the movie is about Cary Grant visiting his elderly aunts who run a rooming house, and they poison their elderly guests. So this slowly becomes clear to Cary Grant. That's what the movie's about. So at one point, one of the aunts says to Cary Grant, "Oh, the gentleman died because he drank wine that had poison in it." And Cary Grant, with his eyes popping open, says, "But how did the poison get in the wine?" And sometimes I think that that's the question that defines my whole approach to journalism. Don't just report there was a bottle of poison wine and somebody fell over and died, but why did the poison get in the wine? Who put that in? And in many cases, we ourselves in the West, in the invasion of Iraq and other projects like this, are the ones who have poisoned the wine that we all now have to drink.
Stephen, one of the things that stuck with me from my days at university was a lecture I received from a lady I mentioned at the top of the programme called Carol O'Reilly. And she talked about how after the Vietnam War, how there was, it certainly wasn't subconscious, but there was a kind of a coming together of politicians and the military particularly to make sure that the American people never had the access that they had during the Vietnam War to what was really going on. I've read about this extensively, and I know you have, and you've written about it. I was too young. I was born in 74 as it was coming to an end. But people could see, couldn't they, what was going on in Vietnam. It was right there in their living room. It wasn't sanitised in any way. And the spin couldn't really be applied to it in the way that we've seen in recent years. Are you of the opinion that there certainly was a concerted effort by certain agendas to make sure that that never happened again? And one of the consequences of that is the embedding process, which, again, I know you've written about, where a journalist goes in and travels with the military, whom they become dependent on, whom they get to like, and they get to feel safe around, and they write from that perspective. That was concerted. It definitely happened, and it's been a huge problem with respects to the truth coming out of places like Syria and Libya and elsewhere.
It's certainly true that military and political leaders looked back over the Vietnam War and decided that one of the big problems that the United States faced there was that Americans were confronted with the reality of what was happening there. That reality was so horrifyingly contradictory to the official line that American people turned against the war. So political and military leaders did realize that they can't let this happen again. They want to try to be sure it doesn't. And the embedding process was a great example of how they responded. That really got into full gear during the Iraq invasion. And as you said, reporters travel with soldiers. They're inside the tank. The soldiers are protecting their lives. And I think that's a great way to cover the story of what it's like to be an American soldier in Iraq. But that is not covering the Iraq war. That's not covering Iraq. That's covering what happens inside a tank. So if you only have one reporter to send, for example, to a place like Iraq, where do you send them? You send them to embed with the American troops. That's the wrong way to do it. If you have 5 reporters, send one to be embedded with the American troops and let the other 4 go out into the country. But very few institutions have 5 reporters. So you get a very skewed view, and we then become shocked at how it is that so many people in the world don't like what we do when all the reporting that we get tells us that we're doing wonderful things.
What about the train of thought? And I'll put my cards on the table now and I'll be honest with you. This is something I believe passionately. Never thought I would do now. Some years back when I was in commercial radio, I never thought that I would develop the sort of opinions that I hold today. I can't believe anymore, Stephen, that these are a continuous and a constant series of bad decisions based on old deep-rooted mistrusts or hatred of certain ideologies in the Middle East and elsewhere. I don't believe that. It's financial greed and it's bad planning that leads us to every 3 or 4 or 5 years go into a country and try to remove the government there, while at the same time telling people around the world these people have to go because they're killing their own people. I just can't believe that. I think it's far more sinister than that, Stephen, and there's a far deeper agenda at play that has never really been looked into or discussed in, at least not in mass media or mainstream media. Now, you know the sort of opinions I'm talking about. Do you have any sympathy for that point of view, or do you not? How do you see that?
I do believe that at the root of all of this is the desire of the West to continue dominating countries in other parts of the world. It's not an accident that our proclaimed enemies there, the countries that we consider to be our enemies in Syria now, which are the Syrian government, Iran, and Russia, are all countries that have refused to cooperate with us. They will not do what we say. They defy us strategically, militarily, politically, and, as you point out quite accurately, economically, which is no small thing. So, there is a danger to becoming a conspiracy theorist and seeing everything as a conspiracy. On the other hand, there's also a danger of the opposite, which is to become a no conspiracy theorist and believe that everything is the way it seems. And that's just as dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed people over the years like Jim Mars. You'll know Jim from Texas, who wrote a lot about JFK. I've had Jesse Ventura on programs, David Icke, and others. And they're asking questions like that, and they continue to ask these questions. Why this constant bloodlust? I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people a year in the region. Look at what Saudi Arabia is doing to Yemen at the moment. With our blessing, of course, the weapons they're using there have been bought and created and built in England. And yeah, I just don't see it as a series of bad foreign policy decisions. I see something deeper and more sinister. And I'll tell you what, Stephen, and I've only got a couple of more questions for you. I do appreciate your time, by the way. I'll tell you what, I believe that part of that agenda, and I'm glad you said that about conspiracy theories. A lot of our listeners will be interested in that. I think part of that agenda is to drive this mass migration of people across Europe into countries like Germany, Poland, further west into France, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Because I do believe there's a sinister agenda to shut people like you, and I'm not kissing your backside, but I mean it, and others up by way of basically controlling the opposition by dividing and conquering people. Because I can't believe, Stephen, that they don't know that by supporting these crazy jihadists because they want rid of Assad, they must know that they're going to displace millions of people. What do you say to that?
There's no doubt that human suffering plays a very small role in the calculations of Western governments, particularly as it has to do with the Middle East. For us, it's all a big kind of geopolitical chess game. It seems it's very sterile. I still remember when Madeleine Albright, our former Secretary of State, was asked about the sanctions on Iraq, and she was confronted with a UN report that said that 500,000 children had died in Iraq as a result of U.S. sanctions. And the question was, do you think it was worth it? She didn't even question the number. She just said, yes, right. It was worth it. And the reason was, of course, we had to make a political point to Saddam, to hurt him, to show the world that we were going to punish him. And the fact that 500,000 children died, some of whom I literally watched dying in their hospital cribs, didn't seem really to be that important compared to making a geopolitical point. And I think we're seeing some of that callousness playing out every day in Syria right now.
Is that psychopathy, Stephen? When you get somebody like Albright saying that is a sense of, or a kind of psychopathy, isn't it?
I would say that the blood and the cries of those little children will be following her from this day to the ending of the world.
Yeah. Folks, it's 13 and a half minutes to the top of the year. We've got Stephen Kinzer on the line. Go to his website, stephenkinzer.com. His books are terrific. All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. Absolutely outstanding. His most recent book about the Dulles brothers. the brothers John Foster Dulles, Alan Dulles, and their secret world war. And a brilliant question from Madeline from you coming in on Twitter. By the way, there's been about 50 to 60 tweets on this, and I will read some of them out when we say goodbye to Stephen in a couple of minutes. A huge interest in this. I had an email from Madeline, coincidentally, who asks this: Stephen, how do you go about as a young man or a woman now coming out of university, if graduated as a journalist? How do you go about then being an independent journalist and travelling in the region like Syria, or travelling in a region like Libya and writing what you actually see there, spin free? That's a great question from Madeline, because it's becoming almost impossible now for graduates coming out to do that, isn't it? How do you do that? Obviously, there's a financial cost that you're going to have to incur. You've obviously got to fear for your safety, and maybe that can maybe explain why we don't have, young Stephen Kinzers, young Robert Fisks anymore. What do you say to that?
I think that the emergence of the internet and the collapse of daily newspaper foreign coverage has some negative effects, terrible effects, but there is a positive side to it, because it used to be, if you wanted to be a reporter covering some interesting part of the world, you only had a limited number of outlets to which you could apply. Now you don't need to go through that filter. So I recommend to young journalists, and I've known some that have done this, pick an interesting part of the world and just set yourself up there. Go there. So where should you go? My advice is to pick what I call the Goldilocks country. So not a country where there's so much going on that there's 1,000 reporters there already, but also not a country where nothing's happening. Find a country or a region where you think there's more going on than the press is reporting. And then you can be the person who brings real news. So I've seen people set themselves up. I had a former student who went and did this in Beirut. She started doing freelancing and radio reports and various work with other journalists there. She helped write a book about artists in Lebanon. Next thing you know, she was producing news stories that were remarkably insightful. So I'd say the fact that you don't have newspapers that now want to send you off and set you up with a full-scale bureau is a negative, but it can also be a positive opportunity, because it means you're freer to go where you want to go and to try to create and find your own audience.
Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the programme. You are, of course, teaching by way of lecturing young journalists, which gives me some heart that there are still great men and women out there who've done what you've done, who've written from the heart, who've told the truth about what it is that you're seeing, regardless of what that means. I think that's absolutely terrific. Folks, find Stephen at stephenkinzer.com. His books, All the Shah's Men, the brothers John Foster Dulles, Alan Dulles, and their Secret World War, and all these other books can be found at all good online retailers. Stephen, I enjoyed the chat. Thanks so much for doing it, sir.
Thank you, Richie. Bye-bye.
Look after yourself. Stephen Kinzer on the line to us there from DC, where he's based at the moment.